I am replacing Tomeo Estelrich, the director of the Center for Ignatian Spirituality and the advisor for the Boston College chapter of Alpha Sigma Nu, the Honor Society of Jesuit Universities. Tomeo regretfully cannot be here today. He was given a COVID vaccination appointment which conflicts with this event, and he is actually being vaccinated at this very moment. So I want to welcome everyone to this very special evening in which we will honor the legacy and trajectory of one of our own faculty members. We like to call this event the last lecture, not because it's the last, or strictly speaking, an academic lecture, but because we want to evoke the best from the person that we honor this evening. To our lecturer, we ask three very simple questions. First, if granted the possibility to give a last lecture, what would you say? And second, what wisdom would you impart to the world? And third, what would you want as your legacy? As you can imagine, these simple questions require more than simple answers. They require and imply a speaker who has devoted her life to the pursuit of intellectual development, a speaker who selflessly has committed to the core principles of Jesuit education, and a speaker who embodies service to others. Dr. Jane Regan is an associate professor of theology and religious education in the School of Theology and Ministry at Boston College. As a practical theologian, a teacher, and a religious education theorist and practitioner, Dr. Regan studies the intersection of theology, adult education theory, and the faith formation of adults. Of particular interest to Jane's research, writing, and teaching is the role of the faith community in serving as a context where adult faith can grow and mature. Among her books are Toward an Adult Church, A Vision of Faith Formation, and Where Two or Three Are Gathered, Transforming the Parish Through Communities of Practice. In addition to her scholarly work, Dr. Regan serves as a consultant on the local, national, and international levels to the important project of effective adult faith formation. After her lecture, Dr. Regan will take your questions. Please write them in the Q&A space at the bottom of your screen. Now, please join me in welcoming the 2021 last lecturer, Professor Jane Regan.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. And thanks to Alpha Sigma Nu and the Center for Ignatian Spirituality for the invitation to give this last lecture. The process of thinking through what I wanted to say as my last lecture has been fascinating. It has also been somewhat intimidating as I think about setting out a sense of my time here at BC. In addition to retiring, I am also just finishing off my 25th year at Boston College. And they have been good years overall, with a few bumps along the way. But what should I talk about? Something that's interesting, inspiring even, to the variety of people in the BC community who might tune in, and some friends and family who are on Zoom as well. Maybe I should talk about how I came to be a religious educator. Well, it's not actually a very edifying story. It's not like the saints who hear God's voice and know what to do. The origin story of my career is a bit more down to earth. Mid-fall semester of my last year as an undergrad, I was still trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. I had spent the afternoon at a school doing an interview for graduate programs and came away more confused than ever on what my plan should be. On the way home, I ran into my pastor, Ron McLaughlin, who listened patiently to my tale of woe. When I was finished, he said, "Why don't you go to Fordham University and get a master's degree in religious education?" And I just kind of stared at him. And then he said, "I'll get you a full scholarship to go there." To which I responded, "Get me a full scholarship in anything and I'll go." I'm very glad it wasn't physics or statistics. Now, to be honest, neither religious education nor ministry in general had been a possible career choice for me. Nevertheless, that exchange began my almost 50 years working as a religious educator in the church and in the academy, 35 of which has been teaching graduate students who probably gave more forethought to their career plans than I did that day. But the fact is, I don't think going through my life career and career choices it's all that interesting. And it sounds to me like I'm working on the outline for my obituary, which I'm definitely not doing. So in the end, I decided to talk about what I always talk about, whether it's in the classroom or giving presentations here around the country. Now, not everyone knows this, but the fact is that college professors really only have about 3 things they say. We say them in all different ways, depending on the course we're teaching and the audience before us. We use just different bibliographies and different resources that are tailored to a particular class. But really, it comes down to about 3 things. Now, that's true for the experienced associate professors such as myself. I remember when I was an inexperienced assistant professor, I thought I had lots of things to say. Important things you should write in your notebook. I've since learned that, in fact, that's really not the case. They appear in most courses that I teach, and most of my writing is built around these 3 ideas. Now, keep in mind, these aren't little ideas like, what does Hans Georg Gadamer say on page 383 of Truth and Method, 2nd edition? That's a detail that might come up, but it's not at the heart of my 3 things. And they're not cosmic ideas either, like God is love. No, I believe that, but that's not one of my 3 things. So I thought it would be appropriate to organize my last lecture around these 3 things. You ready? Before I go, let me make one aside. The process of naming and reflecting on my 3 things has been an enlightening experience. Even if one doesn't teach, I think many of us have 3 things that we say. Things we say that help us to make sense of our lives and make meaning of the world around us. Anyway, I invite you to think about your 3 things as I talk about mine. So the first of my 3 things is this. Adults learn best about their faith in conversation with other adults about things that matter. Now, I think this would be true about adults learning a number of different topics, but adult faith is my niche, and I want to talk about that. I teach and do research and write as a practical theologian and religious educator with a focus on adult faith. Now, to understand what I mean when I say adults learn best about their faith in conversation with other adults about things that matter, I think I need to talk a bit about what I mean by faith, by conversation, and by things that matter. So let me take a moment to touch on each of those. When I speak about faith, I'm drawing on the work of someone like James Fowler, who understands faith to be different from belief or one's religious tradition. Faith, as I'm using it, as Fowler uses it, is about making meaning, about what defines one's life. It's about, and this would be Fowler's idea, it's about being in relationship with an ultimate point of reference beyond myself that provides me with a sense of identity and points to my value and convictions. So if this is how I'm using the word faith, then we can draw out some implications for the focus of the conversation about things that matter, that contribute to adult faith. What might be the topic of these conversations? Let me name some topics that aren't about things that matter. Discussing the contributing factors to the decisions made at Vatican Council I in the 1800s. That would not be one. Or defining the Church's teaching on the indefectibility of the Church. Both of those are important things and important things to know, but they're not the things that matter. When I talk about things that matter, I'm referring to those experiences, questions, hopes, dreams, worries that shape our lives. What does my faith mean for how I raise my children, for how I spend my time and money, for how I engage with and respond to the news of the day, for what touches my heart or my sense of justice, or both? Those are the conversations about things that matter. These conversations, which need to be sustained, critical, and engaging, are examples of the genuine conversation that Hans Georg Gadamer points to when he writes on page 383 of Truth and Method, second edition, and writes, and I quote, "Thus, a genuine conversation is never the one that we wanted to conduct. Rather, it is generally more correct to say that we fall into conversation, or even that we become involved in it. No one knows in advance what will come out of a genuine conversation. Those are the conversations that I believe people want and need to grow in their faith." Now, how did this topic or how did this idea become one of my top 3 things? One of the constants in my teaching career has been my involvement in religious education beyond the BC classroom, particularly adult faith formation on the parish, diocesan, and national level. Now, before coming to BC, I taught at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota for 10 years. And I had the wonderful opportunity to work with a team of parishioners from St. Paul's Parish in St. Cloud, Minnesota, to design and implement a process of faith formation that has as its beginning spot the adult community. We asked first, what does the adult community need to be thinking about, learning about, and talking about? Once we determined that, we designed a program for the adults, and only then raised the question, what do the children need to experience? What formation do they need so that they can do those conversations at their own level? This is the inverse of the way that most models of religious education take place within the Roman Catholic Church today. Generally, our parishes begin with children's curriculum and then invite parents to join in with their children in activities that all can be involved with. But it was in that context of an adult-based program that my conviction on the importance of conversation among adults about things that matter took shape. We introduced into the process small group conversations that were designed to last at least as long as the presentation was. Although it was not an easy sell at first, eventually the parishioners came to recognize that the most formative part of the evening's gathering were the conversations. The 20-minute presentation that began each gathering was simply the framework around which to do a conversation. And in many ways, we taught them they learned much more than the topic that we were discussing. Let me tell you a quick story. The year I left Minnesota to come to BC, the topic of the year was on scripture. And Mimi Bitson, who conducted the adult component of the process, had arranged for a big-name speaker from the Twin Cities to come up to give the all-important first lecture of the season. It was that lecture that really set out the theme for the year. When I called her the next day from Boston to ask her how it had gone, she rather unenthusiastically said, "Okay." "Okay," I said. "I thought this guy was supposed to be great." "Well, perhaps he is, she said, "but not for us." She went on to explain that he came in with a canned talk, not the one they had discussed, and not the one that they had planned and built conversation around. Second, he went over the 20 minutes. People were getting antsy to get to their discussion groups. And finally, during the question and response time at the end of the evening, his responses were kind of offhanded and perhaps even glib. Overall, Mimi said, he made the mistake of thinking that he came with all the wisdom, not recognizing and allowing the wisdom of our parishioners to show forth. If we taught them nothing else, she said, they have come to recognize that their experience and sense of faith are worth talking about and listening to. Now, the experience at St. Paul's was formative for my writing, research, and teaching, and the source of a good number of friends along the way. Now, if this were an in-person event, I would invite you to turn to the persons near you or the stranger in the row behind you and talk about a conversation that you had that made a difference in how you understood your life, in how you see yourself, how you make meaning of the world around you. And while some of you would sigh and roll your eyes at the idea of doing group work, I bet that for many of you, that would be an important and even transformative aspect of the evening's event. Adults in conversation, That's how they learn about their faith. So engaging in conversation with students face-to-face or online, with a team of people to design events and resources that invite adults to grow in their faith, or with a colleague as we share some of the tricks of Canvas or approaches to our teaching. These have been some of the most enjoyable and life-giving opportunities at BC. Now, the second thing I say all the time, in most of my classes, in my writing: documents are our friends. Now, I think that's probably true of many documents, but here I'm speaking particularly about ecclesial documents or church documents. One of the characteristics of the Roman Catholic Church, particularly at the level of the Vatican, though also on the national level, is the production of documents, encyclicals, decrees, declarations, directories that are variously proclaimed, published, promulgated, or printed. Overall, I think church documents are our friends. These documents provide us with a vision of church worth working for. They provide a sense of God's presence and gracious love for us and for all of creation. They can be a source of real hope and encouragement. They are our friends. Now, let me be clear. I don't sit easily with a number of church positions on a variety of topics. Some I strongly disagree with. Two significant ones, the role of women in the church and in church leadership, and a more recent one, the church's stance against blessing same-sex marriages, which is a continuing expression of the church's attitude towards LGBTQ reality. But when I think about the documents that shape my work, that is, documents that address catechesis and evangelization and the nature of the church, I find they point to the promise of what the church can be. Let me give you two examples. Just recently published was the third General Directory for Catechesis. These came from curial offices in the Vatican, and the three documents were published in 71, 98, and 2020. Each address the general needs of the church concerning the nature and process of catechesis. From the first directory in 1971 came this statement from paragraph 20. It's about my favorite statement. They, meaning the pastors, should also remember that catechesis for adults, since it deals with persons who are capable of an adherence that is fully responsible, must be considered the chief form of catechesis. All the other forms, which are indeed always necessary, are in some way oriented to it. Now, that quote has been repeated in every directory since the first one. Now, that is something that I, as a religious educator of adults, can really get behind. The adult catechesis must be considered a chief form of catechesis. I think that's great. And although that's not yet the case in the majority of parishes in the Roman Catholic tradition, there is a promise there that I hold on to and that I point to support my perspective. Similarly, the encyclical from Pope Francis, Evangelii Gaudium, or the Joy of the Gospel, presents an image of church and the believer that is inspirational and aspirational. The document speaks of the church as an evangelizing community, and then goes on to say, and I quote, "An evangelizing community gets involved by word and deed in people's daily lives. It bridges distances, it is willing to abase itself if necessary, and it embraces human life, touching the suffering flesh of Christ in others. Evangelizers, then, take on the smell of the sheep, and the sheep are willing to hear their voice. An evangelizing community is supportive, standing by people at every step of the way. No matter how difficult or lengthy this may prove to be, this church is familiar with patient expectation and apostolic endurance." Now, for me, that's a church I can embrace, that I can share with others, that I can be involved in and live for. That church isn't there yet, and I know it's not, but that is where it's going. And if that's where it's going, I'm on board. So, documents are our friends, and we should treat them like friends. Attend to them with care. Give them the benefit of the doubt. Challenge them when they're wrong, and turn to them for support. Now, where does this conviction come from, this notion that documents are our friends? To some extent, it began with my doctoral work. I received my PhD from Catholic University of America, and the documents were very much a part of my studies. So when I started teaching, I always included them in my courses, even sometimes just as recommended reading. But it was coming to BC and to the Institute for Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry that I began to recognize the role of documents as providing a shared vision and vocabulary to the diverse group of students that we taught. Looking particularly at the international documents, those that originate out of Rome, these gave people, our students from all over the world, a common beginning spot to think about the nature of religious education and its place within the Church's call for evangelization. When the IREPM joined Weston Jesuit School of Theology to become the School of Theology and Ministry in 2008, our shared student body expanded to include more students, more international students, many students from Africa and Asia. Today, almost 30% of our present students are international, coming from every continent in the world except Antarctica and Oceania. Although we have a wonderful admissions team, so I would imagine we'll get somebody from Antarctica soon. Do penguins live in Antarctica? Anyway, we'll get somebody from Antarctica. So, documents are our friends. Friends I have come to appreciate along the way. And that brings me to my third thing that I always say. In my presentation to various groups of religious educators around the country, in my teaching, in the STM, and in my writing. And while it might be the most obvious of the three things I say, it's really the most recent one I've added over the past 10 or 15 years. So what's my third? We learn to be Christians by hanging out with other Christians. Obvious, perhaps, but I want to expand on this a bit, as I did with the other two. In the days following my older daughter's arrival home with me from Russia, where I had adopted her at the age of 3, there were many firsts as she began to become acclimated to American culture and life. One of these was the first visit to a large grocery store. As we came into the store, she caught sight of the multicolored gumball machines and headed over there with hope. She dashed over to them and looked at me hopefully, thinking that I might get her one, although I have no idea if she even knew what they were. I walked over to her and bent down, put my arm on her shoulder and said, quietly, "Regans don't buy gum from gumball machines." She looked wistfully back as we walked away to do our shopping. I repeated that a couple more times, but basically, eventually, Natalia got it that we just walked by the gumball machines, because Regans don't buy gum from gumball machines. A year and a half later, Katie arrived at the age of 2, also from Russia, to join our family. A few days after she arrived, we again headed to the grocery store for needed supplies. As we walked into the store, Natalia took Katie by the hand and walked her over to the line of gumball machines. She stooped down next to her and kind of sadly said, "Regans don't buy gum from gumball machines." With that, Natalia passed on to Katie a bit of what she had learned about what it means to be a Regan. Now, Natalia and Katie learned what it means to be Regan by hanging out with Regans. They took on and interpreted those values that I received from my childhood and came to reframe and appropriate for myself as I moved into adulthood. And that's how adults learn about their faith. Tom Groom, a colleague of mine, in his book, Will There Be Faith, frames the point in this way. He writes, "Many times I've asked gatherings of educators, what kind of community or family does it take to raise a Polish person? Those who aren't offended by my so obvious question call out, a Polish one. Then I ask about forming a Hispanic person, an Irish person, a Korean person, and a few more. By now, few are responding because the questions seem beneath their intelligence. Then I asked the zinger, he writes, so what kind of community or family does it take to raise a Christian person? Again, the answer is patently obvious, yet people recognize the deep insight implied. Close quote. How do we learn what it means to live as Christians, and how do we pass that on to others? How do we as adults, that is, learn to live as adult Christians in the contemporary context? Ultimately, how do adults come to know who they are in light of their faith and express that faith in their daily lives? Remember a few minutes back, in talking about documents as our friends, I remarked on the repeated inclusion over three generations of catechetical directories of statements on the importance of adult formation to the life of the church and to the capacity of the church to accomplish its mission. And for many religious educators, myself included, this was heard as a call for programs for adults. So we introduced Bible study, Lenten lecture series, programs for parents whose children are preparing for first sacraments, formation programs for liturgical ministers, etc. Now, I think these are important, and for those who come, it can be transformative. But I would argue that it's not sufficient. Earlier, when I talked about the first three things I say, adults learn best about their faith in conversation with other adults about things that matter. As I indicated then, the faith we want adults to learn isn't just about learning things, learning about one's religion. Rather, it's about figuring out how to give expression to that faith in one's day-to-day life. It involves asking, what does this faith mean for how I spend my money, accumulate things, interact with others, invest my time, etc.? And for this, we need healthy, inclusive, dialogical Christian faith communities. Borrowing from the work of educator and social scientist Etienne Wenger, I propose that we think of our parishes as a collection of communities of practice. I developed this in some detail in my most recent book, Where Two or Three Are Gathered, Transforming the Parish Through Communities of Practice. For adults to become adult Christians, they need to hang out with other Christians who are intentional about how they live their faith. They are a community of practice, a community of practitioners who are engaged in the practice of being Christian. And I would argue participation in that is how adults learn to be Christian practitioners themselves. Now, I want to be careful here, as this can sound very insular, as though the process of becoming adult Christian is simply and solely the work of socialization. That we are socialized into a way of the way things are done in the context of the parish or the faith community or the university. But constitutive to communities of practice as I propose them is the presence of opportunities and the expectation to engage in conversation. And this sort of gets back to my first thing I say. Adults learn best about their faith in conversation with other adults about things that matter. And in this case, the things that matter includes questions related to the life and value of the faith community. How do we spend parish money? How do we decide on a parish budget? What does it mean for a parish to live out the preferential option for the poor? How do we as individuals and as faith community be intentionally and actively anti-racist? Ultimately, these questions within the faith community are issues that matter, and they are faith issues. Providing opportunities to engage in conversation about these issues and many others is central to the work of forming adult faith. So the focus of thinking of the parish is constituted by communities of practice. What I'm thinking about community of practice, I'm thinking of the choir, the finance committee, the youth ministry advisory board, the catechist, etc. All of these are contexts in which adults gather and have the potential of serving as communities of practice. They have the potential of serving as a context where adults can be intentional about living out their faith. All the settings in which adults hang out together, in which they hold a common vision or focus, in which they engage in conversation together, these are the contexts where adults continue to grow in their faith, hanging out with other Christians and making friends along the way. So, these are the three things that I say. Adults learn best about their faith when they are in conversation with other adults about things that matter. Church documents are our friends. And we learn to be adult Christians by hanging out with other Christians. Now, as I finished my three things, I realized I had one more thing. Not one more thing I say. 3 is plenty. But one more thing that rests behind these other things. Or better maybe, one more thing that describes how and why these are the 3 things I talk about. At the end of my first semester of college teaching at St. John's, I realized that I prepared the course syllabus and assigned readings not based on the best readings, but on the readings that were most difficult. It was important that the students recognize that mine was a challenging and erudite subject. Now that mellowed over time, and I began to see the most important question wasn't how difficult my subject was, but how important. Everyone should have to take my courses, or they should want to take them because they're so important. Finally, I came to realize that my teaching, regardless of the focus or which of the 3 things that I say are included in the course, my courses need to ask and provide resources for us to respond to what I have come to believe is the most important theological question to ask. As a practical theologian, although I think it's true of all theologians, the most important question I address is so what? So what does faith mean for how I spend my days? Which is, of course, how I spend my life, to quote Annie Dillard. I think that there is hardly a better way to spend a life than to regularly ask and be expected to respond to the question, so what? Generally speaking, I don't think we have much chance to think about this or to hear others think aloud about how their beliefs and convictions shape their lives. But that is what I've spent the past 25 years here at BC getting to do with students and colleagues. It's been a gift, and I'm grateful for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Victoria Garcia, and I'm the Assistant Director of Intersections under Mission and Ministry and the coordinator for Alpha Sigma Nu Boston College chapter. I am thrilled to be able to help moderate the question and answer session, and I see I've gotten already some questions in the chat, and I encourage you to put in any more that you might have for Professor Regan. I also have some questions that I hope we'll have some time to answer as well. So we have a question from Mimi Bitsan, and it's actually has to do a little bit with what you just finished. But she asks, can you talk about the role hospitality plays in adult faith formation?
Good question. I think hospitality is key. In my book, Towards Where Two or Three Are Gathered, I look at 4 characteristics of these communities of practice. One of them is conversation, obviously. And a second one is exactly that, hospitality. We're called to be what some people speak of as radically hospitable. And it's in that hospitality that our own faith grows as we share it with others, and that others see and find appealing the way in which we respond to them. And that's at the heart of the process of faith growth and faith formation. So I think as we talk about the communities of practice within the parish, I think the way in which they are inviting people in so that there's a regular process of people coming into committees or organizations or ministries and going out of them. That as that continues, people gain a sense of their place in the parish and a sense of their faith. So I think hospitality is key. That's a good, important point. Thank you.
We have another question. How can we translate the benefits of adult conversations at a parish level to non-parish settings, such as ecumenical dialogue, interreligious dialogue, or political discourse?
I think the bottom line is, and this has certainly been shown in our political world, that people don't know how to be in conversation with one another. That many times it's a debate or a series of monologues. So how do we learn to be in conversation? The only way to do that is by doing it. And so the context in which we engage in conversation, the parish could be one, other opportunities for ecumenical discussion, interreligious conversation could be another. All those ways in which we learn how to express our opinion, to listen actively to the other person, to engage our whole being in the process, suspending our critique until the other person is finished. Those are all essential aspects of that conversation. So the way in which we engage in conversation, regardless of where that happens, is important to our being formed in our faith. Each of those examples are examples of ways in which we're formed in our faith as adults in conversation.
Thank you. A little bit similar or of the same vein, we have a question. What is one hope you have for the future of the church and how parishes can continue to be a place of encounter for different communities?
Wow. I thought just talking about BC was going to be enough. Clearly, I've talked about the whole church. I think that what I hope for the church is that in whatever form parishes take in the future, and I think following COVID, I think everything's up for grabs on how the church understands itself and how parishes function. I think that in whatever way they function, I think they need to be first oriented towards adults. I like children. I was a child once. I raised two. But I think that we need to shift the focus from what's going on with the children to what's happening with the adults. Because it's ultimately adults who have the capability of fully responding to the gospel message. So figuring out how adults gather. Now, again, I want to be really clear here. I'm not talking about adding an extra layer of activities or meetings or gatherings. Rather, how do adults gather already? And in what way can those be faith-formative events? So that, for example, if our finance committee recognized that not only is its role to act as advisor to the pastor in making decisions about budget, but its role is also to foster the faith of the finance committee. So that the engagement in the finance committee is part of the way in which we grow in our faith. And we grow in asking the question and answering the question, so what does the faith have to say to my life? See, I think we need those opportunities to do that. And the more we're able to do it, the more genuine we can become in being the church we're called to be. So the quote that I read earlier from Evangelii Gaudium points to the church that has the role and responsibility of adults at the center and recognizing other people in relationship to that. And I think that's one of the shifts that has to happen.
Thank you. We have a question from Marianne Hinsdale. She says, thank you. And she asks, I know you were talking about adults, but how does what you say apply to emerging adults? The same?
I think so. I think it's the same. I think if we think about the movement from late adolescence through emerging adulthood into adulthood and then into older adulthood, we see that as one continuous movement. And at each point, we need to make meaning of our lives in a new way. Teresa O'Keeffe, in her book, Navigating Towards Adulthood, examines this very question and asks what needs to happen that allows these young people to grow into the expectations of adulthood. Now, again, under being accused of focusing too much on adults, but let me just say that if adults are in conversation with one another about things that matter, how do we expect the young people to be? They're not seeing it. It's not part of their experience. And so the more we can support the adults in that process, I think they then will support the emerging adults as well. Although I recognize that emerging adults need their own approach and their own focus. But I think, again, it's part of a bigger picture.
Thank you. Stanton Wortham has asked a question that was burning for me as well. Why don't Regans buy gum from gumball machines?
Yes, that is a burning question. I just didn't want to be bothered by fighting with them every time we went by the gumball machines. And so Regans don't buy gum from gumball machines. And I thought that it would be an excellent opportunity for them to rebel against me by, with spitefulness, going and buying gum from gumball machines. And I believe that in fact happened, that one of my daughters had quite a bit of gum from gumball machines over the years.
Right, that's great. Kathy Ritas asks, would you suggest your book, Where Two or Three Are Gathered, to help pastors with starting adult faith formation groups?
Yes, but what it's really good at is helping the pastor and the pastoral staff or the people who support the pastor to think differently about the parish. Because adult formation is not just something that happens in adult education classes. The adult formation happens in the very way we make decisions together, in the very way we talk together, in the very way we live together. So I think that that it's not so much forming an adult education committee, although I think one's important and it's important to have one, but rather to see how do all of the groups in our parish community, all of the committees and commissions and advisory boards, etc., how do they all help to foster the faith of those involved in the committee and those outside the committee, so that there's a way in which it kind of is a seeping through the whole network of the parish. We found over time that while adult programs are great, as I mentioned earlier, are great for those who come to them and participate in them, the majority of adults don't, whether it's time or interest or inclination. So we need to figure out a way to help them and to provide them with the opportunity to engage in this conversation. And so all of the ways in which we can do that, I think, is key.
Thank you. Teresa O'Keeffe, who you just mentioned, she asks, as you look back at the experience in the parish, what transformation did you see within the adult community?
Well, here's an example. When we started, this goes back to St. Paul, so it's quite some time ago, but I think it's exemplary. We had, at the end of the discussion time, they sent questions up to the speaker. And many of the questions the speaker addressed, and those that were left, one of us would write a column for the next week's parish bulletin. But they were easy questions, like, why does a priest wash his hands before giving out communion? Or, how did this practice come about? Or, what are we teaching the children in First Communion? Kind of information questions. Within 3 years, those questions changed radically. They changed from being information questions to being so what questions. So how do I do this? How do I make prayer more a part of my life? How do I live in a way that is a sign and a symbol of justice in the world? Well, we could no longer do the column in the bulletin because, in fact, the questions were not questions that you answered in a bulletin. They were questions that you lived out and struggled with in conversation with other adults about things that matter. And that's what those are. So I think it's the capacity to see that what's important is not only the beliefs. This isn't a content-free zone, like we don't have any content, but rather we see the content as the way in which we enter into and engage with the material at hand. So I think those are the primary shifts that I've seen, the primary transformation that I've seen in parishes.
Thank you. Barbara Radke asks, well, thanks you, and mentions that she appreciates the title of your talk. Has your idea of friend expanded during your career and on your faith journey? Could you share any theological connection to the relationship of friendship?
You know, one of the things that a friend pointed out to me when I talked to him about what the three things that I was going to talk about were covered, he said, in each case, you're about making friends. You know, making friends in conversation, making friends in with documents, and making friends within the parish community. For me, I think it's that process of engaging with others whose experiences are different from my own. And in that sense, it's a theological engagement. That again, as I listen to other people, as they reflect to me their own faith and how they live it out, I learn more myself. And that's, to me, at the heart of what Christian friendship is about. It's about that process of supporting one another in our desire to grow in our faith, to become more mature adult Christians, and to express that to the world around us. So it's a companionship, an accompanying that I think is so important.
Thank you. Michael Ochoa asks, can the formative conversations of adults happen in reading? Can I converse with de Lubac about the things that matter?
Yes, I think that the conversations, if you think of somebody like Hans Georg Gadamer, who I've referred to a couple of times, he talks about having conversations with a text, or he talks about having conversations with the scriptures, or conversations with the book. And so I think that the conversation that we can have through written work, through engaging the literature of our field, engaging the documents of our church, can be faith formative and transformative. So I think the closer we read church documents, the clearer they become that they have a word for us. That I think we often, maybe you don't, but I know I can, kind of read through them kind of quickly. Yeah, I know. But to be friends with a document and to allow that document to be transformative is at the heart of listening to the document and really seeing what the document is saying. So yeah, I think we can do that.
Jennifer Bader understood you to say that only adults can live out the gospel completely. Is that correct? And if so, why?
No, that's not quite what I said. I could have said it, okay, but that's not quite what I meant, okay. Clearly, children, young people, etc., live out the gospel. Some ways, sometimes in powerful ways, powerful examples. I think that adults can do it intentionally. Adults have the capacity to adhere to the gospel message kind of intentionally rather than kind of pre-reflectively. One day I had dropped my computer, and my granddaughter, who at the time was 3, was downstairs. And she came to the bottom of the stairs and called up, "Are you all right?" Yeah, I was all right. I was fine. I said yes. And she just kept saying, "Are you all right?" until I came to the head of the stairs and waved to her and showed her that I was okay. Now that care for me was moving, that she understood that her role in the family and her role as a believer is to be conscious of one another. So yes, so she's an example of God's loving presence. But I wouldn't say that I would say that the adult community has a responsibility to live that out in a day-to-day way.
Thank you. Michael Horan asks, you mentioned women's leadership in the church. Women have had a key role in religious formation in parish and school, but not in other roles. please say more about how to hold on despite the frustration that many women and men experience with sexism in the church.
Good question. Thank you, Michael. Do you have another good question? I think we see the way in which women have been engaged in leadership in religious education and in schooling, for sure. And we see the way in which in a parish community, it's often the women who are the movers and the shakers of the community.
Mm-hmm.
And it's difficult to live in a church that doesn't consider women to be in a situation to take on the organization of the church in the way that men do, ordained men do. And I think that the more we, again, talk about this, the more we struggle with this, the more we engage in conversation around this, the better off we are. And again, to demonstrate more clearly what I only have 3 things to say, I would say, again, read our documents. While many of them, again, I have questions about that I would want to raise issues of, at its heart, the church is one that is welcoming, and we need to put that into action. But it's a challenge. It's a hard one.
Thank you. So we probably have time for one more question, and I'm going to be selfish, and it's going to come from me. So and it has some kind of something to do with some of the questions in the chat, but your comments about communities of practice and parish life seem to focus on those who come into the church building. And it seems like people are concerned with, and you mentioned this, how COVID has affected that, obviously how even before COVID, how that's been affected, because that is a decreasing number. How do you contend with this, and what do you suggest for parishes to grapple with this reality?
We're primarily, our role is primarily to be advertise through attraction. That we call people in, that we're willing to ask, people ask us the reason for our hope. And we volunteer that information. Everybody has different areas they work on, and mine is those who are involved in the church. For me, that's where working with that group helps us to strengthen the church, to allow the church to be more effective in its evangelization. So I'm not discounting those who are on the periphery. And this gets back to the point I made earlier, that I made in passing earlier, that what parish looks like 10 years from now, 20 years from now, I think will be very different from what we knew it to be in 2000 and in the years prior to that. So, but we need people who are going to do that. We need people who are going to be leaders in that. People who are going to engage with others in conversation. And so I think that's part of the way in which we engage those who are on the outside. I think there's all kinds of people who are doing work of church outside the parish boundaries, and that's critical work. And I'm just emphasizing a different part of this. I'm emphasizing how we look at and shape the people who are there, so that they can in fact be evangelizers. I believe that everything we do in a parish community is in service to evangelization. We're either shaping evangelizers or we're sending them out. And so in that sense, it's always about reaching out to others and hopefully being in a context in which that's possible.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Professor Regan. Really, this has been such a delight, and we're gathered with, you, like you said, your colleagues, your friends, your family, some previous students. On behalf of the Center for Ignatian Spirituality and as coordinator of Alpha Sigma Nu at Boston College, I just really want to thank you for your words and the time that you gave to us today. You really, truly exemplify our Honor Society's values of scholarship and service, with your dedication to a lifetime pursuit of intellectual development, deepening Ignatian spirituality, service to others, and a commitment to the core principles of Jesuit education. So if we were in person, I would hand you this small token of appreciation, which is just something that you can put in your office or in your home that says basically everything that I just said. But I will be in touch to send it to you in your office. You can to your office or your home, wherever you are right now. But I hope you imagine a really raucous applause, because that is what everyone is giving you at home right now. So thank you, Professor Regan. This was truly a delight. So with that concludes our last lecture. Thank you so much for joining us virtually, and have a wonderful evening.